Thanks everybody for coming today to the Northeastern Harvard Joint Misinformation Speaker Series. This is the third of 4 installments this fall. This speaker series is co-sponsored by Northeastern's Internet and Democracy Initiative and the Shorenstein Center here at the Kennedy School. Before I introduce our speaker today, I just wanted to give a quick plug for the final talk of the fall series on December 18th. We have Vish Vishwanath from the Harvard School of Public Health, and that'll be at 10 a.m. And have we moved to hybrid for that, or are we sticking with Zoom? Because
we're going to do it. It will be hybrid.
Okay.
We will be hybrid.
Okay, so you can
have a party afterwards. So whoever comes gets to do it.
Okay, so you get stuff if you come to that apparently. So that's good. But you know, a party. We didn't call this a party. Just, yeah. Anyway, today I'm really happy to welcome Ceren Budak, who's an associate professor of lots of things apparently at the University of Michigan, information, electrical engineering, and computer science. Her research interests lie in the area of computational social science, utilizing network science, machine learning, and crowdsourcing methods, and drawing from scientific knowledge across multiple social science disciplines and communities to contribute to computational methods to the field of political communication. Her recent scholarship focuses on topics related to news production and consumption, election campaigns, and online social movements. Within that vein, she's co-author of the book Words That Matter, How the News and Social Media Shaped the 2016 Presidential Campaign. Today's talk is The Limits of Low and High Credibility News Dichotomy. So please join me in welcoming Ceren Budak.
Thank you for the invite. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And for, oh, am I thought my mic is on. It is on.
I hear it.
Oh, higher. Okay. I thought I had a really loud voice. Turns out no. Anyways, yeah, again, thank you very much for having me here. And so today's talk, I think this image, very clean, simple image, probably motivates what I'm going to be talking about, which is that the distinction between low and high credibility news is really central to studies of misinformation. And most studies really take this sort of dichotomy at face value and focus on the demand side, thinking about how different low and high credibility news are, why are people consuming low credibility news, and how can we change that. My goal today is to focus on the supply side to try to understand the degree to which this sort of image is reflective of how low and high credibility news operate. And when I'm answering this question, that we're going to get through a number of studies. I actually am not going to be focusing on whether or not, or the degree to which the content that they're sharing are false or true, which is obviously a very sort of main topic, an important topic, just not the topic of today. I do want to point out though, even for that sort of question, there are sort of it's also complicated, I guess, all right? There are studies that show that, for instance, low credibility news, only a small fraction of what they produce is, obviously false. And also for high credibility news, they can share the contextualized information that can be similarly harmful. The thing that I do want to do here is to really examine the production of these two types of players using theories that are coming from media studies and political communication. These theories are used in how we think about traditional media coverage. So what are these theories? Obviously, one that comes to my mind first is perhaps agenda setting. That indicates that the more prominently issues are mentioned in the media, the more salient they will be in the minds of the public. A closely relevant theory that is actually what we're going to be more focused on today is intermedia agenda setting. That refers to the influence that media has on each other as opposed to on the public. And both of these theories have a lot of support in literature, but their stability is in question in today's high choice media markets where people can select different news producers, and news producers also cater to different audiences and might diverge from each other in terms of what they share with the public. So the first two studies that I'm going to be talking about are going to be connected to this intermedia agenda setting question. Another closely related sort of theoretical framework is framing theory. And this is a really vast space of scholars coming from various different disciplines and sociology, psychology, political communication. And due to this diversity, there's also diversity in how we even define what framing is. And in this talk, I'm going to be building on the Entman definition, which is basically political communication sort of definition, if you will, which is focusing on framing as selecting some aspects of a perceived reality and making it more salient. So there are different ways to think about framing. We're going to be thinking about emphasis frames. What are the aspects of an issue that's being highlighted for emphasis? So in that sense, you can also see the parallels between the agenda setting or intermediate agenda setting and framing as well. So with that really high level sort of grounding in mind, I want to take you to the first study that I'm going to cover briefly, which is this paper that was published last year in New Media and Society, where we're really trying to understand bursts of attention on different topics, if you will, and delineation between low and high credibility news with respect to this. The high-level question is, do low and high credibility media operate in distinct or shared news ecosystems? And again, we're going to be looking at this through bursts of attention that is being paid to different kinds of sort of subjects. Let me give you an example to make this a little bit clearer. Billy Long is perhaps a person that was not so well known to many of us, set aside some that are political junkies, until yesterday when President-elect Trump has named him or picked him to lead the IRS. When this happens, there are a number of news organizations that choose to cover this topic. And so when you're thinking about the number of articles about Bill Long, you might imagine that it would look something like this, right? So there's not much attention over time, and as an important event happens, there's this sort of peak of attention that's happening. So these are the peaks, these are the kinds of things that we're going to be focused on in this study. And because I'm really interested in this distinction between low and high credibility news, I'm going to be looking at two different time series, one for high and one for low credibility. So in this case, perhaps you might imagine that there is an overlap in the peak in terms of the sort of burst of attention that they are showing for this particular subject. If this is happening very often, this might tell us that these two sets of news producers are indeed in a shared ecosystem, versus if they are focusing on different subject matters, that might tell us that they are in distinct ones. So that's the question. How do we answer this question? We used the Facebook URL shares data that we got access to through our Social Science One project. This data set includes URLs that were shared at least 100 times and publicly on Facebook in a 1.5-year time period. And so that's the sort of the universe of content that I'm going to be looking at. Given that we're looking at the sort of low and high credibility distinction, we're using a set of lists shared by scholars and fact checkers to identify low and high credibility news. And we're also using the internal Facebook information. Facebook fact checkers are fact checking content. So domains that are sharing articles that were labeled as false a large number of times by Facebook, we also labeled them as low credibility. So I'm not sharing this here, but we had some past work that suggested that these lists do not necessarily agree too much with each other, and they might affect the downstream analysis if you choose one or the other. So we did some robustness checks to use more stringent definitions of low credibility news, and the results replicate. So I'm sort of really not focusing on that right now, but I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A. So once we have the URLs and which domains that they were coming from, we basically use a web scraper to extract all of these articles and end up with 3.7 million valid articles to process. Again, our goal is to think about bursts of attention on subjects. So we need to first identify our subjects. To identify our subjects, we're relying on a neural end-to-end entity linking methodology that was introduced by Kulitsas et al. This method not only identifies entities, but also links them to their Wikipedia pages. So that allows us to focus on noteworthy entities as opposed to just really random ones that do not matter, as well as include rich metadata coming from Wikipedia. So example is, for instance, their popularity in terms of how often people visit their corresponding Wikipedia page. We also did human validation here to see that this automated approach does comparable in the entities that it extracts to what a human would extract from the same articles. And then once we have these subject matters, we want to understand when bursts of attention are happening. So for that, we're relying on interquartile range outlier detection method, which is basically really looking at along the time series, when are the times where you have really outlier attention on that particular entity or subject matter. Okay, so that basically gives us, throughout our study period, 55,000 bursts of 10,000 plus entities. So remember that we started from more than 600,000 named entities, but only a small fraction of them were important enough and had sort of variance in how much they were covered so that we would be able to identify bursts about them. So let me just give you some really high level information about what these bursts of attention look like. Because we have this Wikipedia information, we can identify the categories of these entities that we are looking at and see the distribution of bursts for high and low credibility news. You can see that they're pretty similar in terms of the kinds of things that they are paying attention to, right? But there are important, modest but important differences in that, for instance, low credibility news actually has higher sort of its focus on news, journalism, politics, and government compared to high credibility news, which also is paying attention to art, business, science and technology, and so forth, right? I'm not showing you the plot for that one, but we also looked at how this bursty behavior changes over time. And we found that these temporal patterns are really aligned between the two types of news producers. So I'm not going to go into that, but since that's somewhat of a side sort of story to what we want to cover here, which is when do these things align? So that's the question. That's the main question that we're asking. So if I see a burst about, let's say, Billy Long today in high credibility news, is there a corresponding burst behavior of attention on the same subject matter by low credibility news? So we compute this alignment, and then we also compare it to a null model, which basically is done by using a permutation method. So basically, we just permute the labels of domains and look at the overlap. If credibility were not to matter, the overlap that you would see under this null model would be similar to the overlap that we would see under the observed alignment, if you will. And we do see that the overlap is non-trivial. So a large fraction of things that high credibility media are paying attention to, low credibility are paying attention to, and vice versa. but credibility does matter in that that overlap is smaller than what you would expect under the null model, right? So this is, again, telling us that perhaps these two groups are not fully disjoint, but there is enough distinction between them in terms of what kind of things that they are paying attention to. The obvious sort of next question would be, what kinds of bursts align? So we have a lot of sort of rich information about the subject matter, a lot of rich information about the producers that are participating in bursts. We basically run a statistical model to understand for a given low credibility burst, under what circumstances we see a corresponding high credibility one. So this is the result for that analysis. I'll highlight a couple of things. So publisher slant is playing an important role. When the average slant of publishers that are participating in the low credibility burst is conservative, those kinds of bursts are much less likely to have a high credibility correspondence. When we have this low credibility publishers that are participating in the burst are popular, they have high traffic, then that burst tends to be more likely to have a corresponding high credibility burst, right? So it's really sort of overall popularity is playing an important role here. It applies also for the entities or the subject matters themselves. If the subject matter is an important one, if there's attention to being paid to it by low credibility news, there's also going to be an attention paid to it by high credibility news. So far, and also there are differences in terms of the categories. You can see that there's really much less likelihood of having alignment for instance, the topic of science, technology, and medicine. So far, what I've done is really just assign these labels to these domains and flattened them, and then just compared these two groups. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about definition for the operationalization of low and high credibility. I sort of think of them as lying along.
Yeah.
Are you just sort of drawing a line somewhere and then saying everything over here is low? And
Yeah.
So would you expect to see differences near that margin?
That's a great question. So right in this
it'll come back.
Okay.
Trying to change.
right, it's fine. I don't need it for this question. So so we are relying on lists that were shared by sort of scholars that are out there, and some of them use subtypes. So we really restricted ourselves to sort of the fake and highly misleading categories to define low credibility news. But as I said, we did some robustness checks to change how stringent that definition is. And it really doesn't change our downstream analysis in terms of how distinct these two groups are. But I've seen in past studies, past work, we've looked at how much like making these changes matters in terms of downstream analysis. And for some, it really does matter. So I think that's a great question. Yeah.
Sort of related to his question. Is it reasonable to say that some sources are high credibility on this topic and low credibility on that topic? For instance, I might trust the New York Post to talk about certain things, but not others.
No, that's a great question. I am not aware of a study that really does this in that fine-grained level, but presumably that could happen. But I don't know of studies that do this.
Yeah, I don't think that, like I read the New York Post on the New York Met, but otherwise, yes, but I don't think there's any differentiation, and most of it is looking at political and civic news, and so but from any of these sources, sometimes they mix. Most of them do mix.
Exactly.
True-ish content with untrue content.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's definitely like there's a continuum for all of this. Yeah. But I mean, I think part of the reason why maybe I don't want to get derailed too much, but part of the reason maybe we don't have studies that do this is like really it's hard to look at a single piece of like message and assess factfulness, and to do that at scale across multiple topics. But I think that may be changing a little bit with some sort of LLM improvements. So it's possible that one can do this for a future study. No, yeah.
Just one follow-up. Are you using NewsGuard data as your underlying sort of source, or what?
We did not have that at the time, but we had one of them was coming from
Your
you. We had yours, we had PolitiFact, we had 5 different lists that we were using, and again, sort of robustness checks and trying to determine if we only consider the domains that are listed by multiple. So doing these kinds of checks, and it really doesn't change.
And they
too
all
much.
sort of line up, especially when you get into the really advanced stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So so far, as I said, like we have this sort of mapping, and I'm flattening them, and I'm comparing them. Another way to think about that would be maybe taking a more complex system approach. I'm a sort of networks person, so whenever there's a network to be seen, I would like to see it. So that's what we're going to be doing here, which is that we're going to try to identify the network of relationships implied by publishers' news coverage timing. So how we do this is that we treat each unique burst as a cascade. And our goal is to find the optimal graph, underlying graph that is unknown to us, that best describes that timing of shares. So let me just try to sort of make this a little bit more intuitive. Imagine that we have this sort of timeline, and we have multiple domains. Some of them are low, some of them are high credibility. And we have a number of bursts, right? So let's imagine that I have this burst about Paul Manafort at this particular time. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be taking a slice of time, 7 days before and after. Again, we did robustness checks. It doesn't really matter. I looked at that time period and then look at which domains have talked about Manafort around this time. So you might imagine maybe domain 1 first talked about it, and then domain 2 followed that, and there might be many others here. Again, we have multiple bursts, so we might have another burst later on about Eric Trump, and perhaps we observe a similar pattern. Domain 1 talks about it, and then domain 2. So if we have a large number of examples like that, that might indicate to us that domain 1 is perhaps influencing domain 2 coverage. So our goal really is, so we have these cascades or bursts, which basically is signified by the time when a domain talks about an issue. And we have a large number of them. Given the timing, we want to infer the tree of diffusion. And given these sets of trees of diffusions, I want to infer these underlying graph. Now, solving this problem optimally would be really expensive. It would be a super exponential problem, which basically simply means don't even try. But there is a approximation methodology that gives you a near optimal graph that best describes the timing of these diffusions. So this is the method that we use based on the Gomez-Rodriguez et al. Sorry, I missed et al. There. And infer the underlying graph. So that's what we did. And now I'm going to show you what the graph looks like. Here we have the green nodes that are high credibility and the orange nodes that are low credibility. There's a couple of other things here, which again is sort of other networksy things that one might want to do. But it's really this very striking delineation between these two types of producers that is, I think, the first thing that we are seeing here. And as I said, we do a number of analyses here based on networks. We look at the sort of authority scores of nodes in this graph. We look at sort of the assortativity or disassortativity of nodes, which is their tendency to connect to a high credibility node, tendency to connect to low credibility node, and vice versa. I'm not going to talk about these because I think my goal was really sort of this delineation, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on here. So what this study, I think, maybe tells us is that if on the one hand, you look at that really striking sort of network graph, that might tell you that there is a very clear distinction between low and high credibility. On the other hand, when we looked at this sort of statistical model or when things align or do not align, we saw that the distinctions were most visible for non-political topics and for unimportant entities, right? So, but when we're thinking about the role of low credibility media, we generally are thinking sort of high profile cases, high profile important issues and topics and elections and so forth. So the question might be, does that distinction stand when we are considering these well-established topics and figures? There's also sort of partly another reason that our data is maybe indicating that that might not be the case, but also past work on looking at issue attention cycles suggests that media play different roles in different parts of this issue attention cycle. They work differently for well-established versus emerging topics. So when we look at these sort of more well-established topics, we might see a different pattern. So that takes me to the second paper that I will talk about. This is a paper from earlier this year from ICWSM, where we wanted to understand how convergent or divergent the coverage was for presidential elections for low and high credibility media. And we have two case studies. We have the 2016 and 2020 elections. And in the sort of burst alignment paper, we were looking at a wide variety of topics that were being discussed. So it was meaningful to sort of look at these bursts of attention. When we're thinking about presidential campaigns, there are only a small number of entities that we're looking at. So here we take a different methodological perspective and focus on what are the aspects, what are the attributes that low and high credibility media associate with these candidates through their coverage. So this is our way of approaching these media's agendas when it comes to presidential elections. So we want to understand how the candidates are depicted in these two types of media. Our data set are coming this time from the candidate-related headlines. So we used the Wayback Machine to get the daily snapshots of homepages of low and high credibility media. And here we have almost exactly the same list, except that we don't have the Facebook fact-checked domains because that was our IRB only covered that study. So we are back to using the list that were shared by recent scholarly work and fact checkers. So we find these low credibility and high credibility news, identify their domains, go to their homepages, daily extract headlines that mention any one of the candidates. Here I'm showing you only 2020, but you can imagine the same thing applies for 2016. And we look at how the candidates are depicted using two different levels of attributes following sort of related scholarly work. The first attribute type is what Kim and Min refer to as central themes. These are macro level attributes that describe an abstract conceptual category. So idea might be how often through the headlines, we see Trump being associated with healthcare, housing, energy, social welfare, and so on and so forth. And same thing for in this case, Biden. The second level of attribute we look at is what Kim and Min refer to as aspects. And these are micro attributes with a lower level of abstractness. So these are basically keywords, right? So instead of just looking in really high level, how often Trump is being associated with healthcare, we can ask questions of how often is Trump being associated with COVID or with vaccines and so forth. To do this, we need to identify these two levels of attributes, aspects and central themes. How do we do this? We construct dictionaries to answer this question. And the way that we do this is that we had a number of dictionaries, the main one coming from one that is based on Comparative Agendas Project. The nice thing about having that as your typology is that Comparative Agendas Project very nicely overlap with public policy kinds of questions. So these topics are, healthcare, energy, housing, social welfare, very sort of nicely connected to public policy and agenda setting questions. And then we extended them using our collaboration with, in 2016, Gallup, in 2020, CNN and SSRS. We had created these more election-specific dictionaries. So we combine them, and we do this through inter-rater, reliable decoding to make sure that the dictionaries are working well. We also extended these dictionaries using a semi-supervised topic model called guided topic noise model. That's basically just the goal of that is to augment the dictionaries and increase the coverage, increase recall, if you will. And now we did human validation again, and the human validation showed that this automated approach is comparable in terms of how much it agrees with humans. It's comparable to how much humans agree with each other in terms of what a topic is for a given headline. So given these dictionaries and given these headlines, we can identify for a given headline, for instance, what are the aspects or the keywords that are being mentioned, but we can also aggregate that up to the topic level to determine if a particular headline is about, let's say, energy or healthcare. Our examination showed that it's choosing the most common, most frequent topic gives you the best option. And I think that works well because headlines are short. So just one topic is a good way to approach it. It might work differently if you're looking at maybe full articles. But once we have that, then we can map that. Basically, we can create these vector space representations of headlines, and then we can aggregate them across multiple headlines that are published by different news producers to see their similarity or difference. Our goal is really to compare these low and high credibility media, but we wanted to contextualize this somehow. So we want to compare how much they agree or how much they diverge or converge to how much we see this for left and right-leaning outlets. So again, we create these vector space representations, and then we can make these comparisons to see the extent to which the agendas align. We can also do this temporal analysis, which I'm not going to talk about here, but who leads or who follows in this sort of space. And because we have in each election year 2 different candidates, we can do this separately for different candidates and separately for different years to see how much things generalize. So that's the goal here. So let me just give you the sketch of one of the results that we're going to be seeing. So here, I'm hiding the results from you, but we have on the x-axis, for a given topic, what is its topic coverage percentage for low credibility domains, and on the y-axis, I have it for high credibility domains. So if we expect these 2 groups to largely diverge from each other, you might imagine that we would have some topics here that are, of interest to high credibility news, and then we might have some topics here that are going to be of interest to low credibility news, right? So that's this group is basically saying that the percentage is high for low credibility and low for high credibility, and vice versa. Just pause for a couple of seconds for you to guess for yourself what you're going to be seeing. And here is the result. I'm showing you the topics. We have 26 topics for the Democratic and the Republican candidates, so those are colored accordingly. We have policy topics, controversy topics, and horse race topics. And you can see that almost everything is aligning perfectly along this diagonal line. So in comparison to what we have seen in the burst alignment study, when we are focused on a sort of a high level, sort of well-known important topic like election, it seems like the coverage of these 2 types of producers is really quite aligned. And it's basically the same in 2020, although there are some differences. So just aggregating that to a correlational measure, you can see that the correlations, at least at the topic level, are insanely high. And you can see that, but you also see the sort of keyword level alignment. I'm showing you here 2016, 2020 alignment along the credibility line and alignment along the ideology line. And they're pretty similar and both very high. There is some partisan asymmetry. in that the Republican agenda is agenda about the Republican candidate is really aligned, but the agenda about the Democratic candidate is less so. Right? So it's and this applies both to Clinton and Biden's coverage. There's also a drop in divergence from 2016 to 2020. So these are the comparisons across these 2 years, particularly for at the keyword level. So I'm not going to go into the details here, but really the second finding is that the biggest divider, reason for this divergence is the candidate controversies, perhaps unsurprisingly. The Democratic candidates' coverage is particularly getting more attention. Actually, you don't really see that for Trump's controversies. So they're pretty aligned for that, yes.
So I was just, maybe you're going to get to this, but I was curious if you have a theory of the causal error with this story. Is it low credibility producers driving high credibility news, the opposite, or is it stuff that's happening in the world that they're just focused?
That's a great question. So I actually did not, I was not going to have, I have a backup slide about that. So who leads, who follows. You might imagine that, oh, it's low credibility news that's the cause of this, but you're actually seeing that the driver is traditional news. So they start covering it first. The difference is that I guess for them, newsworthiness is quite important. So when it becomes not so newsworthy anymore, they drop it. Versus the low credibility news keeps focusing on that particular topic. So that's particularly the case for the controversies case. Happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. Any other questions? Great. And especially, so when we're thinking about at the topic level, it's really traditional and the low and high credibility news have really similar attention to Trump controversies, which is quite surprising. And as I said, the difference is for the Democratic candidate. But at the keyword level, you actually see there's a huge drop in correlation from 2016 to 2020 when you're looking at the keyword level for the Republican candidates. So in terms of how much they are focusing on the topic itself is aligned, but they are picking different keywords, different attention focus the low and high credibility news. And looking at that a little bit more carefully, you actually see that it's more around the Democrats' treatment of Trump's controversies as getting more attention from low credibility news compared to high credibility ones. And as I said, I was going to say, I'm not going to show you the plots. I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A, but we did Granger causality tests to determine this causation between these two time series, who's leading whom. And we also did that in a 90-day sliding window way to be able to determine if these patterns change during the election cycle. Okay, so that's, now with that, I'm going to move on to the third and the shortest part of this story. And this part is ongoing. This is not a published paper. And it is really motivated by my dissatisfaction or discomfort with even my own work in terms of how I'm treating how similar and different these two producers are, abstracting a lot of it away and boiling things down to topics and keywords, but really taking a view from nowhere, thinking not as much about morality, is not as much about power, is not as much about agency. So that's dissatisfaction brought me to the critical media effects framework to think about what kinds of topics should I be actually looking at in terms of what the low and high credibility media are covering, and are they really different or similar in those kind of cases. So this ongoing work, I'm looking at different marginalized groups and how they are being covered by the high and low credibility media. But the one that I'm going to cover here is going to be about immigrants. So how are low and high credibility media covering the immigrant herself? So I'm here going to be relying on a framing typology that's introduced by Benson in his 2013 book, Shaping Immigration News, where he's looking at how whether immigrants are framed as victims, heroes, or threats. And an immigrant might be a victim of global economy, humanitarian crises, of discrimination in their host country, or they might be a hero because they bring cultural diversity to their host country. They might be, integrating well, or are hard workers and so forth. Or they might be a threat because they take jobs, or they cause sort of public order concerns, fiscal concerns, or national cohesion. So to answer this question, this data is going to be smaller. I'm looking at this 3-month slice of data at the end of 2023. So leading up to this election, where immigration was really sort of top of mind, and there are some indications that there was some shift in how people perceive this issue. So if I take this sort of agenda setting question seriously, I might want to see what is the potential role these different media actors are playing. How are they depicting the immigrant? And so the question I'm asking is, how often do articles about immigration frame immigrants as victims, heroes, or threats? And here, turns out, very replaceable by LLMs, does just as good of a job as I do in labeling things. So we're going to be relying on that. Here we are. Okay, so this is the result. We're looking at the proportion of articles that are mentioning the immigrant as a hero, threat, or a victim, coming from left-leaning, coming from right-leaning, and I'm going to break it down by the credibility of the domain. Here's the result for heroes. A really, really small fraction of articles are mentioning immigrants as heroes, and there are really no practical differences across both ideology and credibility. Let's look at threats. The majority of articles, no matter what the credibility or the ideological leaning, is depicting the immigrant as a threat. And there are differences along ideology, but no real differences along the credibility line. Yeah.
Quick clarification. Threat evaluation. Is that using threat language like this? Like if I could say you are a threat versus you are not a threat.
It's not. It's not used. So it is right. It doesn't have to explicitly say that the sort of person is a threat, but it might be indicating that we are having, for instance, fiscal issues due to the immigrants would be classified as the immigrant as a threat. So these are the categories are these over here, which is
and if someone if there's something that says they don't pose a challenge of fiscal funds, that's saying they're not a threat.
They're not. Yeah.
Because of the negation of all of the.
Oh, right.
Negation of each of these get coded.
So again, because I'm feeding the entire article, it's using the entire context. So it's supposed to actually do this properly. And again, it is in terms of my validation of looking at how much it agrees. It seems that I would be surprised if it would fail in that dimension.
The dictionary-based approaches
would fail. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So then again, so what we're seeing here, and then when it comes to victims, there are differences, right? That the left and right, but really like barely little difference in terms of the the credibility for right-leaning domains, and for left-leaning domains, it's the not credible left-leaning domains that highlight immigrants as immigrants' victimhood. So with all of this, I know that I threw a lot of sort of examples at you, but I wanted to sort of use this sort of breadth of examples to really think about this sort of dichotomy in what cases we see it actually occurring versus not. And I think my interpretation from this study is less black and white and more shades of gray. And it really depends on what context you're looking at it. So if you're looking at overall coverage of what are the things that they are paying attention to, it seems like there is a clear distinction. But when you're thinking about really sort of high profile issues, wedge issues, things that are like maybe top of mind when we're thinking about what is low credibility media doing to us, they are a lot more similar to each other than what you might imagine. So with that, thank you to my collaborators, especially the PhD students who did all of the great work. They take all the credit, all the mistakes are the advisors and the faculty. These are the sort of the links to the papers, and I would be happy to take any questions you might have.
When you talk about low credibility, oh, wait.
So the people listening.
Yeah.
Yep.
When you talk about low credibility media, are you distinguishing between media that's just sort of, sloppily done or, poorly edited versus, media that's like deliberately misleading?
Right. So
Those are different things.
Those are different things. Yes, absolutely. And sometimes they overlap. So it is true that these newer news producers, some of them might have different intentions, but also might have, they might not have as much training in journalism. Therefore, I guess I would say that there might be some correlation between these two dimensions that you're mentioning, but I'm not making that distinction. So I think that probably is a limitation. I'm talking about this dichotomy here, and I'm keeping that dichotomy in the way that I'm analyzing things, right? So that I think that would be a self-criticism, and one might imagine breaking this down and thinking about what would happen if you were to look at these different groups. But I will say that the one thing that is maybe a sort of a heuristic might be these really well-known low credibility news tend to have a lot more of a sort of expertise and are sort of more aware of journalistic sort of standards. When we're looking at those, they actually align more. So the more popular low credibility news tends to align more with high credibility news. But yes, I have not done this sort of deeper inspection of what makes something low credibility, and if we did these different separations, what would happen with that?
This may be related to that point that you're making. In the graph with the heroes, threats, victims, the standard deviation seemed to be higher on low credibility.
Yeah.
And so is that just inherent in the low credibility that there's going to be a higher standard deviation? And how do you explain that?
Yeah. So it is also because they have fewer articles. So I have less data to assess them. And that's actually also connected to another thing that I think it's important when we're thinking about this, really focusing our attention on low credibility news. There's less, they produce less content, and they also get less visibility. So versus traditional news, they produce more and they have sort of more visibility, which might be another reason why we might still be sort of more paying more attention to what they are doing and what kind of decontextualized information they might be sharing. But so I think the biggest reason in this case is the scale. Yeah, great question.
Thanks so much for sharing your research. It's really fantastic. I have a quick question about, you're looking at the domain level, and one example is, let's say, the Wall Street Journal. They have like news coverage that's very devoid of opinion, and then there's like opinion. Do you have any sense of all the domains, what percentage, especially on the low credibility, are they more opinionated? Are they taking spins and punditry?
Yeah, so we didn't look at how spinny the content is. I completely agree with you when it comes to sort of traditional news. The news versus opinion divide is a big one. So there we might maybe repeat this by filtering out opinion and only looking at hard news. And there we might see a more like clearer distinction. I don't think that we're going to find that kind of grouping. Anecdotally, I didn't do this sort of evaluation at scale, but when you look at some examples of low credible news, the distinction of here, this is an opinion and this is news, is not marked, so we can't really use that. But if we were to use it for traditional, my guess is that they might look more dissimilar to each other. But at the end of the day, when you have the Wall Street Journal label. You have that label, and people sort of consume that in similar ways.
In the analysis of tempo, maybe the later ones are more opinion.
You mean like later articles or later introduced domains?
No, articles.
Yeah, and again, I haven't done that, so I don't want to speak too confidently, but again, anecdotally, I'm just generally seeing that it is a lot more opinion but it's not labeled, so we can't really do that. But again, that might be another thing to throw at LLM and see if it can distinguish if something is opinion versus hard news, and then do that separation and do that analysis. That would be a really interesting examination.
Thanks for a great talk. I wonder the degree to which there's an economic explanation for a lot of this. So
Yeah.
if you are a editor of a low credibility site, almost your entire purpose is to get traffic
Yeah.
for any individual
Yeah.
article. And if you're an editor of a high quality site, you certainly have the economic motive, but you probably also have a public service motive. And on any given topic or breaking event, it's essentially each event is an economic opportunity, and there's going to be a certain amount of mind share available, and there's going to be a certain amount of clicks available. And so I just wonder if on the economic opportunities expand greatly when it's Trump saying something outrageous, because there's just a lot of economic opportunity, and there's much less for sort of low salient, and so I think that's where differentiation actually matters much more. So I don't know. I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great point. I guess I would have expected, based on the sort of the assumption that, I mean, I do really think that the economy, the sort of economy aspect is quite important, and which is why we have some other studies where we look at what are the ads that are being, like, what kind of ads, like what kinds of low or high credibility news sites are showing ads, are making money out of that, and how can we change that dynamic? But again, I guess if we would, based on this, I would have expected more of differentiation, right? You might say that perhaps traditional news should say, well, I'm going to skip that highly controversial and clickbaity Trump topic, and I'm going to focus on policy. But you look at that, the sort of plot I was showing you, diagonal, traditional news are spending just as much time on controversies as low credibility news, right? So it's, I would have expected, if it was this the sort of public service was playing a significant role, that I would see a much clearer delineation between them, and we're not really seeing that. And the way that we're seeing that for the long tail, it's actually I feel like goes on the other side, which is that actually low credibility news are spending time on these like long tail entities that are not being paid attention to by high credibility news, which is understandable, right? Because high credibility news is like news. What is newsworthy? It's important people that are newsworthy. So perhaps they don't have that distinction in low credibility news. But yeah, I think that that's an important aspect. I just wish that I saw bigger differences there.
Do have one from somebody watching online. So they asked, for the first paper, if I understand correctly, the two news ecosystems, low and high credibility, cover distinct topics at different times. So they are not all jumping on the same topic or issue, but their bursts and coverage are correlated. Given that these temporally similar bursts seem to be on different topics, why do these bursts tend to happen together? Can we speculate on potential reasons?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it partly might be this question about, again, for a given topic, there are multiple types of entities or subjects that are involved. So my one sort of hypothesis might be that they're sort of focused on similar events or things that are happening in the real world, but low credibility perhaps focuses on a different subset of entities that are associated with that compared to traditional news. And that would be also partly explaining why we are seeing the low credibility news, high credibility news distinction being the biggest for the unpopular entities.
Last question.
Is this thing on? Okay. So this was amazing, Hojam, first of all. My question will be about the web scraper
Uh-huh.
that you used, because like I saw that like the number of URLs that
Mhm.
you had were 7 million or something
Yeah.
that went down to 3 point
Yeah.
something. That,
Yeah.
looks
So
huge.
we have,
So
so
it's-
I skipped all of that. We have the analysis of where we lose things in the supplementary
Exactly,
material of the paper. Most of it is like it's it's balanced in the way that the kinds of things that we lose across, like it's not like we are biased for like high versus low credibility. And it's also about a big fraction. I know I forgot some of that. I wish I had this plot in front of me. But there is the articles that are no longer there is one example. There are cases where things cannot be parsed. We use all kinds of different parsers. And then we looked at the cases where we couldn't parse things. And at the end, they really end up being articles that are like not really articles, that they don't have like substantive content. Yeah, there is in the supplementary material, there's this schema, if you will, of like, here's what we started from, here's where we lose things. And so you can get a better sense of.
But you say it's balanced though, because like I was thinking like, this is a follow-up to John's question perhaps, but like whether we use the high credibility ones and lose the ones who are using, I don't know, blogger templates, low cost website templates that are hard to scrape perhaps, like, or weird code, like weird front-end code. So I was wondering if there would be
Yeah,
any
I think so.
potential
When
biases in-
I say balance, I think this was more in terms of the number of domains, but not necessarily in terms of articles. So it is true that these the parsers that we have used work quite well for like the people who are building these libraries want to make sure it works for New York Times, it works for CNN. So these top domains do get much better coverage, but in terms of the number of domains that we're sort of losing, then it's it's more comparable.
Okay, unfortunately, we're well into overtime, so we're gonna have to wrap it up there. So join me in thank. We're gonna have to wrap it up, unfortunately, because we've gone over. Please join me in thanking Ceren Budak one more time for a really terrific talk.